long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum Jay Carson. Hey, Jay.
Good morning, Mike.
How you doing?
I'm doing like as well as, I keep thinking I'm going to have something really clever, but as well as Trump at the Supreme Court, I think.
Yeah, well, there you go. That's not a bad one, which we will get to in just a minute here. But before we do that, I wanted to just briefly thank the folks at Total Recorder for recently helping us out with an audio recording issue we've been having. I've been using Total Recorder to record my end of our Politics Guys episodes for, a while now, and it's just way better than anything else I've tried. And this isn't an ad or anything. It's just something I wanted to mention, given, how really impressed I've been by both their recording software and their great customer service. And so if you have to record something, and you're not satisfied with the options available to you, just check them out at totalrecorder.com. And we'd also like to thank our newest supporters this week. We have Wade, Heather, and Jennifer, who are all new sustaining monthly supporters on Patreon, and Nathan, who is a monthly sustaining supporter on PayPal. So thank you all very much. It means
thank you.
Yeah, it means a lot to us. It is literally what keeps the show going. And of course, when you become a monthly sustaining supporter of the show through Patreon, you get more than just us saying thank you, which is, nice, but all supporters at any level get access to our weekly bonus show. And there are also a bunch of other things we've put together for supporters at various levels. And to check it all out, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can go to politicsguys.com/support. Okay, and with that, let's get to the news from this week. A lot of stuff going on this week, Jay, but I thought maybe the best place to start would be with a late-breaking story. On
right.
Friday, you mentioned it, in the intro there. On Friday, the Supreme Court lifted a lower court's injunction that prevented the Trump administration from moving forward with using Defense Department funds for border wall construction. Now, the ruling was along ideological lines, with the court's 5 conservative justices voting to lift the injunction and the 4 liberals on the court supporting keeping the injunction in place. In the very brief opinion, the majority focused not actually on the merits of the case, but instead on the standing, or I guess lack thereof in their view, of the parties that were bringing suit. And that would be the ACLU on behalf of the Sierra Club and the Southern Border Communities Coalition. So, Jay, I know this was kind of a late-breaking thing, but what's your initial take on this ruling?
My initial take is that the court gets it right. There was sort of in the dissent, sort of some halfway dissents, right? But I think it does come down to either that you have standing or you don't. And the Sierra Club had based its claim of standing on the idea that, the Sierra Club, it's about environmental preservation and sort of like the recreational loss that would happen there, because it would be harder for people to hike and take pictures and would mess up the scenery type thing down at the border. And I think the court said, look, that's not the type of interest that can give you standing to sue on something like this. So I think the court probably got it right. The amount of money we're talking about, of course, is still, I think it's, $3.2 billion?
Well, yeah, the total is 3.2, but the amount that's the focus of this particular lawsuit, and of course there are a bunch of them, is 2.5 billion of Defense Department funds.
Right.
So, I mean, but
either way, in Washington terms and wall building terms, it's a rounding error. I should say that it's more than a rounding error, but it's not the.
It's a good amount of wall.
It's not going to. Yeah, but it's not going to. This is not going to fund a border to border, 50-foot terrific luxurious wall.
Sure.
It's more or less to make repairs and put up that sort of semi-wall fencing type stuff that they've got. So
right. Well, I guess I see what you're saying, and I think I tend to side with the 4 dissenters on this, saying I think it's less the standing issue is at least a little more up in the air, and you may end up being right. I think it's maybe a closer call than you would think, but it seems to me that the logic of
it's a 5-4 core, I'll call it.
well, yeah,
It's
exactly,
one.
yeah.
I mean,
So, but I mean the logic of issuing an injunction in the first case is to say is in instances, and you're the expert here, at least more so than I am, is that when you think that there is a reasonable probability that one side may prevail, and if going forward may cause some sort of irreparable damage, then that's kind of the grounds for issuing some sort of an injunction. Is that more or less, how do I have that right?
You hit it. You got it pretty close. It is that you would need to show a likelihood of success on the merits. That likelihood can kind of vary a little bit depending. It's a little bit of a shifting thing, and you have to show that there's some sort of irreparable harm. And irreparable harm in the law means a harm that can't be made up for in money later on.
Right.
So if it's one of these, you can get your money back or get something paid back, whatever. Then it's not irreparable harm. So I think that's the other question when you go to the merits. What's the irreparable harm? Is that Trump misspent some Defense Department funds? Well, you can always claw those back. So I mean, I think that's the.
But I would argue the other way. I would say that, well, there are two types of harm. Number one is that those funds that are already spent, I mean, you can't really claw them back in the sense that money has been
because
spent
they're appropriated, right,
on wall construction. And not only that, but once the wall is up, it's up, and the environmental damage that's done has been done. And it's not like this wall is going to be ripped down once it's up. And even if it is, that damage is still done. And so, and again, this is... Go ahead.
Sorry. No, because I was going to jump. I was actually jumping in to agree with you.
I'll shut up then.
Yeah, absolutely. No, because one of the other things, the other instances of irreparable harm, as you can claim, is if there's a constitutional abuse, right? That if someone is going to violate the Constitution or exceed their authority or something, that's something that you can't fix with money necessarily. But then the question is, did the plaintiffs in this case have that authority?
Yeah.
To do that. So
yeah, and I mean it's not a clear cut sort of thing, certainly, but and of course there are these two issues here: the standing issue, and then the actual looking at it on the merits. And it seems to me that's not necessarily all that clear either. I would say that the action is, at best, I'll call it dubious, because it seems to me this is an instance of going around Congress to reappropriate funds for something, well, that the administration couldn't get through the legislative process. But that being said, it still might be constitutionally okay because of Congress, delegating emergency authority to the president, and really to me, Jay, that's the larger issue. And that's the issue of too much executive power because in large part because Congress isn't doing its job.
Yeah. But that's not a legal question. That's a political question. Yeah, exactly. I think we agree on that. But yeah. I suppose there may be a legal argument to say that it is improper delegation. But I think that's probably going to fail because usually you've got Congress can't delegate its powers to other agencies or other actors. But there are sort of recognized exceptions for emergency type declarations and so forth. So I think, you'd have that argument, but I think you'd lose it on the merits. And that's the other thing that's interesting is that's exactly what's going to happen now that the stay is lifted. What happens is it goes back to the lower court and it can still proceed on the merits.
Right.
And
in the end, I agree with you. And, we've talked about this issue, this larger issue in a variety of ways. This idea that essentially that there are things that are legally and constitutionally okay that aren't necessarily okay in sort of a larger sense, or in a different sense. And I think this is one of these instances is that, that in the end, I think that President Trump does in fact have the legal constitutional authority to do this, which is not to say I agree with it, but I'm not going to say he can't do it just because I don't like what he's doing. And I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah.
So
No, and
anyway,
that's good.
yeah, well, I knew you'd kind of like that. So anyway, let's move on to the story that sort of dominated the news cycle this week. And of course, that is former special counsel Robert Mueller testified before the House Judiciary and Intelligence Committees about his investigation and report on Russian influence in the 2016 election, allegations of collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign, and potential obstruction of justice by the Trump campaign and administration, I guess. Now, Democrats had hoped to use the testimony to sort of bring to life the contents of Mueller's report. Pretty clearly, that was an effort that fell flat, and in no small part due to Mueller's terse and often halting and confused answers to many questions. Now, Republicans saw this, at least a lot of Republicans saw this testimony as an opportunity to both discredit Mueller and his investigation as essentially a politically motivated, I'll use the term, witch hunt. So, Jay,
Yep.
what did you make of Mueller's testimony?
Riveting. Look, and I didn't watch the whole 5 hours of it, obviously.
Sure.
But I mean, I guess it comes back to what did you expect him to do? I think you can say, well, the performance aspect of it could have been better, right? But as far as the content, you were sort of left with, it's sort of like if you've got, if someone has written a very bad play, and you're going to stage that play, you could have some really good actors, come in and perform the play, but it could still suck. Likewise, you could have, you're going to perform Shakespeare, but the actors are not so good. And that's not going to come off. And here they were really sort of stuck with a script, right? I mean, Mueller said, "Look, my testimony's in the report, and it says what it says." And it's sort of if you expect him to come and read the lines differently, obviously he would open himself up and to the thing of, well, look, if it was this important, I mean, it's not like he was going to come out and say, and you know what, Trump colluded with the Russians.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sort of there was not going to be that aha moment. I mean, the best that I think the Democrats could hope for is he would sort of read the report with more feeling.
Yep.
And again, which is a weird thing. The other piece that the Democrats, I think, were looking at is just to have a hook, right? To hang this on, to say, aha, this is so terrible. Or I mean, the idea that Mueller might have said something to the effect of, look, there wasn't a crime, but boy, this looks really bad. It's really, terrible. Trump's a horrible person. And just enough of that to sort of to peg a hook on to say, oh, look, we need to investigate further. But it just didn't happen. Yeah. And
to me, it was sort of a Hail Mary type of thing because,
yeah,
I mean, of course it was political theater. And even a lot of Democrats said, hey, exactly what you said. This was a way to try to bring to life the testimony for the people who didn't read the report. And I thought it was a very solid, clear, rigorous report. But of course, most people aren't going to read that. But I think the fundamental idea behind this, that people would somehow would watch watch this testimony, hear Mueller, and then say, oh, I've been so wrong, or I was on the fence. And I mean, that to me suggests that so many of these people who are focused on this, both Republicans and Democrats, honestly, in Congress, are living in a bizarre little bubble where, of course, to that part of Washington, D.C., inside the Beltway and the very politically engaged, this is a big deal. But I think it's easy for us to forget how much not of this big of a deal it is to a lot of Americans. And pretty much anyone who's going to care enough to focus on this, on the hearings, the testimony, are people who've already had their minds made up. So I felt it was kind of pointless. And again, I think maybe Democrats were hoping, well, who knows? He could say something. There could be a soundbite out of this. And what do we have to lose? Because everyone already has their mind made up.
Yeah. Well, what you have to lose is the sort of the momentum and the sort of the sense that you're beating a dead horse. So from what I've read in newspaper, people were saying they have sources from inside the Democratic caucus saying that the following day, Nadler proposed that they move forward with impeachment because, like, hey, this went really well.
Yeah,
You know what I
uh-huh.
mean? It's
Yeah.
sort of, and that was sort of shot down by the speaker. But I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I think with impeachment, I think the launch sequence has started, right? And almost now Nadler's almost in a position where if he doesn't keep moving, you just keep looking silly.
Well, I've said before, I disagree with you on that. It's not going to happen. Not only will there not be impeachment, there won't even be a formal impeachment inquiry. And I'm on record as saying that multiple times, and you're on record as saying the other, and we will see what is what there. But there's this other part of the issue as well, and I really wish that this is me dreaming, obviously, that both Democrats and Republicans had focused more on the Russian interference part of things. And, that was the testimony where Mueller was much more clear and certain and all that. And I really think it's more important in the sense that it transcends Trump, and in a better world, it should transcend partisan politics. And I mean, Mueller was very clear.
Everyone should agree we don't want Russians messing with our elections.
Yeah, and then you have some Republicans, even some members of Congress, questioning Mueller and in their zeal to discredit him, talking about talking about how this wasn't that big of a deal with the Russians, and this whole thing was a witch hunt. And I think they should have made much more of an effort to separate the Trump part of it from the Russians part of it, because if we can't all agree that there's strong evidence that the Russians clearly interfered in our elections, and it doesn't matter for what reason, just the fact that they did that should have everyone up in arms, I think. And so I'm deeply disappointed in both sides, but particularly the Republicans who seem, for partisan reasons, to be actually trying to discount the extent of Russian interference to help Donald Trump.
Well, I think the impulse to discount the Russian interference, and again, I call it attempted interference because, as I think Mueller said, and there was no evidence that what the Russians did actually changed votes, changed anybody's mind.
So it wasn't attempted interference; it was interference, but it didn't necessarily have the effect that they wanted, is what you're saying. Just to be
if you try to shoot somebody and miss, it's attempted murder.
Right. So this
you still pulled to the trigger, but
sure
you didn't. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So
I'm trying to steer away from the. Here's the thing. My test would be, had the Russians done none of this, would it have changed the outcome of the election? No, Trump still would have won, I suspect. Especially if you look at, they're going into the Facebook ads and stuff. I mean, the Clinton campaign, I imagine, spent more on vegan donuts than the entire, Russian Facebook budget. But the sense, I think, though, but if this had only been about that Russian interference, would Mueller have been there testifying?
Well, no.
And the reason is no. It's that it's about the president. It's about impeachment. And I think Republicans often look at this and say, look, if Hillary Clinton had been elected, would we be having investigations into Russian interference in the election?
We should.
That's kind of the thought experiment. We should.
That's my point. Yeah. I mean, of course, we can't prove the negative, but I mean, either way, this to me seems to be the one thing that we should be able to get at least. And to be fair, I mean, I'm kind of calling out some of the Republicans who really tried to discount this, but there have been a number of Republicans who said this is a serious issue and we do need to worry about it. And there has been, a certain amount of bipartisan consensus. And from all accounts, it seems that steps have been taken so that in 2020 and even in 2018, the system is more secure than it was in 2016. And that's, of course, a good thing.
Yeah, and I'm going to add one other piece that the Republicans wanted to do, and I think they were very successful in this. And if you want to talk about Russian interference, and again, you may say I'm wandering off into the conspiratorial swamplands, but I don't think so. I mean, the question is, did he look at the dossier, the origins of the dossier that started this whole inquiry into whether there was collusion? And Mueller said, no, he didn't. That was outside of the purview of his investigation. And that's really the only answer the Republicans needed. Did you look at that? No. because I think there's going to other people are going to be looking at it. And that it very well may be that, look, they had a dossier that was sourced from Russian sources. So if you're going to look at one aspect of Russian interference, that would be the much bigger one, right? If that is really the case. Now, we don't know that yet. There's still investigations ongoing. I think that was the other point that the Republicans were trying to make of look, you want to talk about interference. Did you look at the potential that this entire dossier was a Russian plant?
Sure, and the dossier is certainly part of it, but it's interesting to me, not interesting to me. It's totally understandable to me why the Republicans would be focusing on this particular one piece of a much larger puzzle with just ferocious intensity, essentially, because that's the part.
It's not just one piece. It was the what began this whole investigation, right?
Sure, it is. I'm not saying it's an unimportant piece, but the idea that this is the sole focus, and to listen to much of the conservative media, you would think that this is the whole thing, and I think it what it does is it leads to this sort of conspiracy thinking, and let's focus on, and again, I've said before that we should absolutely be concerned if there was any sort of attempt by American intelligence officials to discredit a presidential candidate. Absolutely, there are investigations going on, and we're awaiting the results of those investigations. But this whole thing of just focusing on, well, let's try to discredit Robert Mueller and the investigation when this is a guy who, remember, this is a Republican guy who has a record of decades of integrity and of being just incredibly above board, and was picked by Republicans to do this, and all of a sudden he comes out with some findings that make the president look bad. And now this is a disgraceful guy who is just awful and is out to get the president. And to me, that is just ludicrous.
See, I think you're maybe just reading body language or questions differently than I did.
Sure, I wouldn't doubt it.
Right. I mean, I didn't see that much hostility towards Mueller personally.
Wow. Okay.
I would have interpreted it more as hostility towards sort of the process, to the report, sort of the incompleteness of the look. If you're looking at Russian interference, why didn't you look at these questions? And his answer was simply, look, that was beyond my scope, beyond my mandate, and I think that's that may be the correct answer. But they make the point, and they raise the point that it should have been included. And again, I'm going back to, if there wasn't the dossier, if there wasn't these outlandish claims, and again, this is, if true, would have been the biggest intelligence spy story in the history of the country, right? And would we have had a special counsel appointed? Would we have had a special counsel appointed to investigate Russian interference through what they did, right? I don't think we would have.
Yeah,
I think.
But on that point that you mentioned about Republicans not really attacking Mueller, I mean, you have Tom McClintock saying that Mueller desperately tried and failed to make a legal case against the president and made a political case instead. You have.
Well, I guess he's attacking him.
I mean, you have Republicans calling him fundamentally unfair, throwing a bunch of stuff up against the wall to see what would stick. That's Ken Buck. That he managed to violate every principle. That's John Ratcliffe. He wrote a one-sided attack on the president. That's my own representative, Steve Shabbat. Had an amazing double standard. That's Representative Jim Jordan. I mean, the list goes on and on.
No, I think that's a strong, legit criticism. The double standard. I think that's kind of what they're getting at. But look, I hear you. It's there was sort of an attack the messenger, I suppose. Maybe I don't see it as much that way, just because of the biases we bring to this.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
it always
quite
reminds
honestly, if I'm a Republican congressman, my one or only questions would be, look, you had some conclusions here, Mr. Mueller. You concluded that there was no evidence of collusion, correct? Correct. Thank you very much. I mean, you know what I mean? So I think that the report ought to be celebrated. It ought to be like, Trump shouting no collusion. That's probably the better way to handle it politically. But regardless,
although as we talked about before, collusion isn't even a term. It's
right.
just this made up sort of thing. But it sounds good in a tweet, and that's really the important thing.
It sounds like something you don't want to do.
Yeah, no, you definitely
shouldn't be doing.
Don't want to. But it reminds me of that old adage back in the day. We used to say that politics stops at the water's edge. Pretty clearly, that's not the case anymore. And Jay, I wonder if maybe that's because back when we used to say that sort of thing and mean it, it was because we felt that the enormity of the, at that point, Soviet or communist threat was so much greater. And now we sort of feel like, well, the Russians are a problem, but it's not like we're in that kind of atmosphere of the 60s, 70s, 80s, where we're thinking there's nuclear Armageddon and just right around the corner, essentially. And so I wonder if that plays into it as well.
A little bit. I would say I'd be a little more cynical and say I don't know that we ever really meant that, right? I mean, you can look back to Vietnam. You can look back to the nuclear freeze movement and those sorts of things, where there were sort of obvious partisan breaks on foreign policy.
But I think
typically. Yeah.
I was going to say, I think, though, at least a perception of a more extreme threat tends to unify a lot more. And right now, while Russia, we feel like Russia is a threat, it's sort of harder to wrap our heads around sort of a cyber threat from a almost kind of developing country, formerly great, that just happens to have a bunch of nukes. But it doesn't feel, and certainly, we're both old enough to remember this, Russia doesn't feel nearly as threatening as it did in the 1980s, and even China, which is our main, I would argue, strategic, threat now, doesn't feel threatening in the same way that the Soviet communism felt, and that makes a difference.
Exactly. And if you were to ask me or most people on the street of how do you feel about a Soviet Russian? See, there it goes. Back in the day, man. Wolverines. Yeah. Tell me if you get that reference. But I mean, if which would you prefer, a Russian Facebook attack or a Russian nuclear attack? And most people would say, well, the Facebook things, that's no good. But given the choice, I think it's their Russians are seeing it. It's seen as an annoyance. And there was an interesting piece. This is maybe a little off topic, but I think it's something interesting to raise anyway. In the New York Times last week about the Russians hacking into electoral systems, and it determined what they had done. They, because of the way our systems are set up, they would not have been able to change any actual votes because the votes are still recorded on paper. What they could have done would be like mess with registration information, which, had they done that, it could have been a real headache on election day. If they had done it, but to do it like meaningfully, you'd have to do it on a big scale. And if you did it on a big scale, it would necessarily show your hand that it's the Russians doing this.
Sure.
You know what I mean? So it's one of those sort of, if everyone's registration in whatever county is canceled all of a sudden, then, okay, somebody must have hacked your system and this is not legit. There again, if they also just like change a couple of voters' addresses, and they have to fill out provisional ballots, it's not going to change. It's not going to make a difference.
This is why, though, I mean, there are still some states or parts of some states where there isn't a paper trail anymore. And that's obviously, I think, a pretty important concern that has been addressed to a certain extent, but not as much as it could be. I think we should go to all paper ballots in all states and all parts of states. We're not there yet, certainly. And I know you're not saying
I'm with you there. Yeah,
and you're not trying to minimize this. You make
well, yeah, I am.
Well, okay, I would disagree.
Well, again, if we're talking, nuclear attack.
Sure, it's not as bad as a nuclear attack, but in a way. I'm not going to say in a way it's worse, but in a way it's more insidious because the sort of attacks that don't feel like anything until all of a sudden we find that, confidence in democracy and the results of elections has been undermined. That in a way can be maybe not worse, but even more troublesome in a certain way, because then all of a sudden it's like, well, what happened? And we're at this point where our institutions are crumbling, and maybe the Russians found a much better
sitting
strategy.
in a bunker with your shotgun, fending off the other survivors, saying, "Well, at least our electoral system's still intact."
Yeah, there's that. That would demonstrate electoral
Thank God
system.
they didn't hack us.
Sure, yeah, I hear what you're saying. Anyway, so why don't we move on to actually a surprisingly, for most people would say, a surprisingly positive piece of news. Negotiations between Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin resulted this week in a bipartisan budget and debt ceiling agreement. Now, the agreement, which was praised by President Trump and passed in the House on a 284 to 149 vote, will suspend the debt ceiling until July 31st, 2021, and increase total discretionary spending from $1.32 trillion this fiscal year to $1.37 trillion in fiscal year 2020, and then $1.375 trillion in 2021. Now, this represents essentially the final stake in the heart of the Budget Control Act of 2011, which, while technically set domestic and military spending caps, but in reality, it was used as kind of a mechanism to negotiate yearly budget increases, with Democrats agreeing to more defense spending in return for Republicans agreeing to more domestic spending. Now, even with this agreement, Congress will still need to pass yearly budget legislation, but the agreement on overall spending levels should make that a much less fraught process than it's been in recent years. And the people most upset with this agreement were conservative Republicans. They pointed out, they voted against it. Republicans voted against it. Almost 2/3 of Republicans voting against it in the House. And the main argument here was that you have these increases in spending by nearly $1/3 trillion without doing anything to actually reduce the increased deficit and national debt. So, Jay, what did you think about this agreement?
Well, you phrased as kind of positive. I see it very much the other way.
Okay.
I think you hit the nail on the head where you said Democrats could agree to more spending on defense and Republicans could agree to more domestic spending. The point is everybody's agreeing to more spending. And if you are a conservative fiscal Republican, which Trump is not, this is a disappointment for conservative budget hawks, and it'd be people who look back to say, oh boy, I wish we had the old style conservatism back, right? That wasn't all about social issues or immigration or tweeting, or just sort of the old school green eye shade type conservatism. Well, this was it, and you sort of lost it. And so I'm very much disappointed. I know a lot of others on the right are also. Now, I think you can make the argument that there's a strategic point, and there are so many fronts open right now that maybe Trump didn't need to have another front or another budget showdown, because that's the way these things have worked. The only way that Republicans have ever gotten any sort of meaningful spending cuts have been through this brinkmanship, which is not good for the markets, is not good for I think the national psyche, I guess. So there is this sense of a relief of, look, we're not going to have this drama, right? We're not going to have approaching the fiscal cliff type thing. But at the same time, so much of the savings that we did get, I mean, and this is back in the Obama era, who touted these savings, was because of the Budget Act of 2011, which had the sequester in it, and forced some of these spending cuts. So not even spending cuts, but spending limits. Except again, there was a way around it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the problem, because, of course, current Congresses can't bind future Congresses to anything, because future Congresses can just vote to, undo what they done.
But still, there was I'd call it like a political speed bump still.
Right? Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah.
It's sort of like the difference between having the money in your savings account where you actually have to go withdraw it and then spend it, as opposed to your checking account where you can just spend it. Yeah. There's that little bit of like, yeah.
Yep.
So
that's true. That's true.
So I would say that, fiscal conservatives lost this round. Now the rationale that's come out of the the Trump administration was sort of we're going to pick our battles, and that this seemed to be a battle they didn't want to take on right now, but and maybe the after 2020. He'd have more flexibility, so to speak.
But that's what they always say, right? I mean, it's sure once
exactly, yeah. And that's sort of the continual Republican lament of there's always like, all right, look, we'll give a little on tax increases or spending increases here, but we're going to get some cuts, next year, next time around, and it just never seems to happen.
Yeah, I don't know if you heard about this, but I am not a fan for a lot of reasons of Tom Massey, who's a representative from Kentucky, but he actually forced a vote after it was passed. This bill, he forced a vote on changing the title of the bill, which is the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2019, which is a nice kind of sounding thing, right?
Sure.
He forced a vote on changing it to a bill to kick the can down the road and for other purposes.
I love that.
It got 47 votes, but not quite enough. But that kind of thing should be sort of. But I mean, it gets at what you were saying. In fact, the Wall Street Journal, in a more high-handed way or a more elevated way, talked about the bipartisan spending party, and of course they're absolutely right on that. One thing I wanted to point out about this: there's been some talk, especially on the left, about how this is a repudiation of President Trump by his own party, especially in the House. And I would say
the other way around.
Well, not really so much, because even though 2/3 of the Republicans voted against this and Donald Trump wanted it, it's important to remember that, the leadership knew the votes were there. And so many of those Republicans could afford to vote against it. And this is one of these things that
it's what they call a free vote for the Republicans.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think a lot of folks don't necessarily appreciate that voting is often as much about strategy as it is about policy preferences. And so I wouldn't read that much into this, but that's one thing I wanted to point out.
There would be absolutely no upside for a House Republican.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say that because I'm sure there are some who have voted for it. But the very limited upside for most House Republicans to vote for this bill.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's going to pass anyway over your objections, and at this time you have the opportunity to say, hey, I'm sticking to principle. I may lose, but I'm still sticking to the low budget cutting principles that I campaigned on.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm protecting myself against potential primary challenges from the right.
Exactly. One part of this we didn't mention is there was sort of a side agreement where Democrats agreed to keep policy riders out of budget legislation. But that, I think, and there were some on the left who were upset about that. But honestly, the way I read it, I don't even know that that's enforceable. So I just think that's sort of a throwaway sort of thing. Not much of a concession really at all. It's one of those things where everyone gets something and the only loser is future generations, basically. And, to that point, I wanted to say I am not necessarily against all deficit spending. You can make a case that, for instance, the United States.
We made that case in the 80s.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can take it too far, obviously, but the U.S. can borrow at lower rates than anyone else for a lot of reasons. And if you can borrow at, say, 1%, and you can invest it in things that net you 2%, 3%, 4%, you'd be crazy not to do that sort of thing, right? But the problem is if you borrow at 1% and you invest in things that don't get you less than 1%, then you get deeper into the hole. So you can't just lump all deficit spending in, together. But that being said, we clearly are not doing enough of that kind of investment spending. We take a look, the national debt was $19 trillion. It's hard even to say that. When Donald Trump took office, it's $22 trillion now. This year alone, we're paying out $350 billion in interest on the debt. And of course, from the left, one of the issues that we have is, there was a $1.5 trillion tax cut in 2017. And, the administration said it'll pay for itself. Well, Congress's Joint Committee on Taxation said, no, it's going to increase the debt by $1 trillion over 10 years. The Tax Foundation said, no, only $0.5 trillion. Yeah. And even then, remember that in that tax agreement, individual tax cuts are scheduled to expire in 2025. And that was really kind of a gimmick. Everyone expects Congress to make those
Right.
permanent. And
Right.
if they're made permanent, it's going to cost $2.3 trillion. So, I mean, the basic idea seems to be, hey, let's cut taxes and raise spending. And that's only going to work for so long.
Right. No, I agree with you on the general principle of that, but also consider there are other factors that go into tax policy, and particularly, and this is something we agreed on back in the day, on the corporate tax reforms.
Yeah.
In that would help companies, encourage companies to stay in the United States, invest more in the United States, as opposed to being lured away to places like Ireland and so many other places in the developed world where they had much lower tax rates. So I think there is something there, and I think in that sense there is that investment that you can get. And something else, another reason Republicans often are more in favor of spending on things like infrastructure is because there is more of a measurable investment bump, a tangible asset that you get at the end of the day, as opposed to just bigger government operations, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think in principle we would tend to agree. The other thing I think about in terms of deficits and debts is you have to balance it against what your GDP is. So obviously, if you've got it's not so much important what you owe. It's what you owe compared to what you make.
Yeah. And we're getting to the point, though, where we're at, not quite, but we're at like World War II levels. Yeah. And that's, when you're fighting a world war against the Nazis and so forth, that's, you understand you want to spend some money. But here, this is, I think, just an incredible amount of fiscal irresponsibility. We've got no Nazis.
So you're okay with the spending increase or not now?
I am okay. No, to be clear, I am okay. In fact, I think we need to spend a lot more, but I also think we need to tax a lot more in a different way than what we're doing it now. Right. I've been for a long time, and this
you are the party of high spending and high taxes.
I am. In fact, I would like to see us move to much more of a European style system, which maybe not quite to that level, but certainly I would like to see. I've been a fan of a value added tax for a long time, which I think would be simpler and could eliminate a lot of other taxes. And there are actually plenty of people on the right who, in the past, had championed that idea as well.
Yeah, well,
so
we moved to value-added tax. The next thing, we've got soccer in the metric system. So.
Oh my God, we can't have it. Anyway, let's move on. What do you say? This week, the Federal Trade Commission announced its biggest ever fine. Facebook's going to pay a $5 billion penalty and also submit to a number of oversight and regulatory provisions as part of a settlement agreement with the FTC. And this,
there
of
you
course,
go. We just made $5 billion back.
Well, there you go. Rounding error, right? Anyway, now this stems from a lengthy investigation of Facebook's alleged non-compliance with an FTC settlement reached in 2012. Now, key provisions of the settlement, in addition to the fine, include a third party privacy assessor who's going to report to the FTC, a new privacy monitoring group appointed by Facebook's board of directors, a requirement that Facebook conduct privacy reviews for new products on any of its platforms, new compliance officers, and acceptance of specific rules to further safeguard user privacy, like, for instance, requiring users to opt in as opposed to opting out of facial recognition. Now, the vote on the FTC to accept the settlement was along party lines. The three Republican-appointed commissioners voted for the agreement, seeing it essentially as a better option than a long legal battle with an uncertain outcome. The two Democratic-appointed commissioners opposed the settlement because they felt it wasn't a sufficient penalty or a sufficient check on Facebook's activities. Now,
that's kind of the free vote kind of thing, right?
Well, I see what you're saying, yeah. And of course, this is combined with the Department of Justice this week announcing a new wide-ranging antitrust investigation of big tech. Now, Facebook wasn't mentioned by name as a target, but the statement on the investigation referred to market-leading online platforms. And so, obviously, that's going to include Facebook. Right. But the weird thing here, not weird, totally understandable actually, is you could argue that it's actually been a good week for Facebook. They announced quarterly earnings of $16.9 billion. That's up 28% from a year ago, and it actually beat market estimates. And in addition, while, the company's stock dipped a little bit this week, it's up 56% since the beginning of the year. And so it seems like despite all this scrutiny, it's not really having much of an effect on the bottom line here. So, Jay, what do you think just in general about this agreement? Would you agree with this? Do you think the settlement was a good thing?
From a lot of times, a settlement is a good thing just because it brings certainty.
Yeah.
Right. And that's I think something that, look, okay, we're paying $5 billion, but okay, we know we're paying $5 billion and you can budget for it and work around it. And it's much better than having that uncertainty of what might hit you.
Right. And in fact, they did that. I think they set aside $2 billion of it last year and $3 billion of it this year in preparation. They realized there was going to be some sort of a settlement. I think the markets kind of built that in too. Right.
And it's also just the idea of if you get some control over your own destiny, there's also probably some a sense of relief of, look, this is, we can work with these regulators. Or
we can work these regulators.
I think that's because that's in the real world, that's the way it tends to work, right? I mean, it's not as if it's not all adversarial. I mean, it is adversarial, but there's also the sense of, companies ought to be able to negotiate and work, bring the market knowledge of here's what works, here's what doesn't. And so I think, also it sort of maybe puts them out in front of, these issues. Facebook's bigger problem had been Europe, right? As far as getting hit with fines, and the European privacy standards are a lot more onerous, and the penalties a lot higher than what they are here. So again, there may be a sense of relief of, okay, we've got this deal, we know what we're working with. It's not going to be like Europe again.
Yeah.
So I can see all those kind of factors playing into that's going to buoy the stock, and just other general economic conditions may, play into that too. It's hard to, we're not stock analysts, and I haven't, dug deep on this, but that's my sense.
Yeah. Well, I certainly would have liked to have seen more of a push to make Zuckerberg more personally responsible, because ultimately, because he owns a majority, he sort of decides on these things. The FTC didn't even bother to depose him here. And so I get that desire to do that. And so I want to side with the two dissenters. But then I come back to thinking about the incredible legal acumen and skill that Facebook would have brought to a trial in the years-long thing, and you don't know what the outcome's going to be. And in the end, I think that this probably was the best of not so great options here. I think it certainly sends, it doesn't do as much as I'd like to see, but I think it sends a message. It does do something. It sends a message to other big tech companies as well, I think. And so I'm a little conflicted on this, certainly. What I'd really like to see, Jay, is I'd like to see new privacy legislation from Congress. Because to me, the bigger problem, and again, this is something we talk about again and again and again, is these regulatory agencies kind of trying to do what they can without, I would argue, sufficient clear guidance through legislation. Yeah. I don't think privacy legislation has kept up with this. I think the FTC and other agencies are doing their best with outdated legislation.
Based on what the statutes that they have, which are not designed to deal with the challenges of today.
Exactly.
Or tomorrow.
Yeah. So, what I would love to see is Congress pass privacy legislation more along the lines of the GDPR in Europe. Now that's not going to happen now, but, maybe in a Buttigieg administration with a Democratic Congress, we'll get that. I don't know, but it's certainly one of my hopes. But the larger point here is it puts these regulatory agencies in a really difficult position, because also when you don't have that legislation, you open yourself up a lot more to potentially successful legal challenges. Now, even if there were legislation, there's always going
to be legal challenges.
But you're a lot more insulated from that. You have a lot more likelihood of success if there's clear legislation, which means also that probably you can negotiate a bigger, stronger settlement, because, of course, Facebook or whoever else would know that as well.
Yeah. No, you are right. You are correct on all counts there.
Well, that's nice to hear. But moving on to that other part of it, the antitrust investigations. do you have any, we haven't really talked about this a whole lot, but do you get a sense that it would be a good thing if we saw really kind of serious antitrust action, maybe breaking up some of these natural monopolies like Facebook happens to have?
Well, I again, I'm a little hesitant, and the specifics on this investigation. I mean, there really aren't any, right? It's been pretty vague.
Just announced.
It's just sort of we're launching a big investigation of big data, which that sounds good, I suppose. But you go to what's the basis, the whole reason we have antitrust law. It's not to break up big companies. No. It's to protect competition.
Yeah.
And I think that's the question then is there a fair competitive field out there, or is Facebook somehow exercising monopoly power, Facebook, Amazon, whoever else, to keep other actors out of the market? Now, that raises some other questions as to what exactly is Facebook, what exactly is Amazon, right? In some ways, you would think that Amazon is sort of like a antitrust regulator dream, right? I mean, here it is, like you can get all these different products from any different place. I mean, Amazon would seem to be like the most pro-competitive sort of invention that someone could imagine. It sort of introduces this big element of market transparency that didn't exist before or didn't exist easily.
Well, but that gets to something we talked about before, is that antitrust law traditionally has focused on, more than anything else, not exclusively, but more than anything else, on price. That's how we measure harm or benefit to the consumer. And when you're dealing
that's
with...
how you know if someone's exercising monopoly powers, if they have power to raise the price beyond a certain kind of deviation. Right. There's a lot of math involved.
Well, at least that's one. I mean, that's been the traditional standard. And the problem here comes in when we're dealing with Facebook, which is a free service. Right. So all of a sudden, these calculations are different. What do we mean by benefit or harm to the consumer? Now, it's easy if you just look at the pricing, but when you talk about, well, how does this affect the ability to innovate of other companies? How does this affect privacy, which is hard to put a price on, and all these other things? And again, it's the example, I would argue, of the technology far outstripping our sort of legal infrastructure, which is what's causing a lot of these problems. And so I would expect that the Justice Department is going to run into a lot of the same problems with the antitrust investigation that the FTC has run into with Facebook, is that the legislation just hasn't kept pace, essentially, is my view.
Yeah, and again, I think it's something that we need to look at. What exactly do we call these services? Are they essentially like billboards on the side of the road, right? That's the market is, do you own all the billboards and therefore you can control all the billboard advertising? To me, that would be the big, as opposed to, do you control all the, do we have the most consumers going there? And again, those are just questions no one's ever really asked. So, I mean, whatever comes out of this, I think it's going to be interesting, because they're going to have to come up with really a better or newer sort of rubric as to how to look at these companies, and what exactly is it that they're doing, what service are they providing, what price are they charging, who's the consumer, all those kind of things that we haven't done. But again, my sense, I would tend to push back against we need to break these companies up because they're big.
Right. Yeah. And I think just size alone I would agree with you there, is no reason to break up a company. It's a matter of what is the effect on the competitive environment and on and you only care about the competitive environment because we know that that's what gives consumers the best products at the lowest prices and that sort of thing, and most innovation. So we
and it that. Could, I mean, is there something stopping someone else from coming up with a good Facebook competitor?
Right. Absolutely.
We should do that.
Yeah. All right. We have time for one more story, and it's about the automakers, actually, who 4 of them, representing around 30% of the U.S. auto market, struck a secret emissions agreement. Well, it's not secret now, but the negotiations were secret with the state of California. The agreement calls for emission standards to rise to a fleet average of 50 miles per gallon by 2026. That is slightly less than was required by an Obama-era regulation. Now, the Trump administration has called for a freeze to the Obama fuel efficiency increases, and it's also hoping to revoke California's authority to impose its own emission standards, which that was written into the Clean Air Act of 1970. Now, the automakers are Ford, Honda, VW, and BMW. They cited a need for predictability as really the key reason for the agreement, as well as a desire to lower their compliance costs. And California has, for its part, has agreed to stick by this agreement, even if Democrats win the presidency in 2020. In addition, 13 states, the District of Columbia, and Canada have pledged to follow California standards, and other car makers might end up signing on to this as well. So, Jay, what do you think about this agreement?
Yeah, look, it's a voluntary agreement between these manufacturers and the state. There's nothing. I don't see a constitutional bar to it. You could say it's a Commerce Clause issue, but as you pointed out, there is a carve out in the Clean Air Act that allows for the California emissions standards. So I look at the car companies probably look at this as, hey, it's a much like the Facebook FTC thing. It's sort of a half a bite or half a loaf. Yep. They get standards that are less onerous than they would have under the Obama standards, not as good as they would have gotten from a Trump federal standards. But you get the predictability, and it's also a matter of California is a huge market and really so much controls emissions on so many, almost anything you can imagine that emits, something. It's sort of California standards kind of become the default because of its outsized place in the market. So it's one of these, the companies have to make their own decisions as to what's best. And
you've mentioned this before.
Out,
you've mentioned the predictability thing before. And of course, that's a big concern if you're the automakers thinking, well, is there a reasonable chance that a Democrat can win? Well, maybe we should lock in something here, and that's again, and I know we keep on coming back to it.
I think perhaps maybe they're going to be a little naive. And it's one of those, wait, we got a great deal. They promised if a Democrat wins, they're still not going to renege on this. Yeah. They will,
maybe they will and maybe they won't. That remains to be seen. But the larger point is that predictability is just incredibly important. And the other point I would say is that if you can I could see conservatives making a case that California's waiver should be taken away. And if that's the case, okay, well then propose legislation to amend the Clean Air Act to take that waiver away. But I don't think there's a strong case to be able to do that through essentially administrative fiat. And we've talked about that.
I would agree. Yeah, you can't do it administratively. It would have to be a congressional act.
Yeah.
And I think there would be a lot of let's put it this way: if no one's complaining about it, right, and if these big automakers aren't complaining. Then there's not going to be any sort of political force to do it. I mean, the complaints might come at some point, I guess, from consumers who are having to pay more for their cars or trucks. But again, that pain is so spread out, so diffuse. Yeah. You know what I mean? It just doesn't rile people up as you might think.
Right.
And quite honestly, look, if it happens that the pain of higher car prices are hurting our auto manufacturers, then they'll reconsider what kind of deals they want to make, and they'll try to cut a better deal. Yeah. So,
and I really think that in a larger sense, this is sort of my favorite kind of regulation. I like all kinds of regulation, you know that, Jay, but
you love them all.
Well, but this is my favorite when it's possible. And here's why. I mean, this is an example of the government just setting an overall goal or a standard and just saying to an industry and applying it to an entire industry. So there are no carve-outs for various companies, that kind of crony capitalist sort of thing, to level the playing field and then just say, hey, you figure out how to do this. We're just going to set the overall standard. We're not going to send a bunch of regulators in and all that kind of thing. And these rules that can be gamed and all that. To me, whenever you can, I'm not for despite what people might think, I'm not for regulation for its own sake. It's supposed to serve a purpose. And the other things being equal, the least intrusive form of regulation is the best, not only because it allows businesses the most freedom because it's also the least easy to be, or the most difficult to be gamed in a way. And so this to me is the kind of regulation we should try to have as much as possible in other areas as well. That's not getting, deep into the guts, but basically just saying, here's the standard, here's what you have to meet, go figure out how to do it.
Yeah. So the counterpoint to that argument would be, and again, I don't see there's a whole lot of political will to have this fight, but just on principle, the guy in Montana who has to pay more for his truck than the person in LA because California, or I shouldn't say.
I see what you're getting.
They pay more because of what some regulators, some state legislators in California decided, and he didn't get a say in it, and emissions aren't so much a problem where he lives, and he really has to drive his truck a lot because everything's really far apart. So that would be the objection that. Are you allowing one state to have an outsized role in creating the regulatory framework for the country?
Right.
But I think, look, that's a question that Congress should take up and take up back in 1978. And if you want to change it, that's the way you have to take it up.
Yeah. And I've said on the other side of that, the argument would be, well, this is a problem that's not, confined to California because it involves, climate issues that are sort of not only national, but global and so forth. But again, that's a whole other issue. Certainly.
Right. And yes, I would say to the extent that the issue involves, feelings of pride and value. I'm just off today this morning.
Pride and value. Pride and value are good things. Absolutely.
Yes. No. The virtue signaling.
Okay. Sure.
That would tend to be a California issue. There is a lot of, as economists would say, utility for Californians, and the virtue signaling that the guy in Montana might not appreciate.
Gotcha. And I guess on the other side, I would say
have more limited utility for the other.
I guess I would say that the climate, that the California folks would maybe not as much appreciate the climate denial of maybe some of these other folks who aren't willing to chip in to save the environment. But again, that's a whole other issue. So before we get into that, why don't we just stop there? But we're not really stopping because, of course, as soon as Jay and I are done recording this show, we're going to do our special supporters exclusive show. And this week, we're going to be talking about the federal government bringing back executions as well as the 9/11 Victims Fund extension. So if you're a supporter, that will be in your podcast app by the time you hear this. And of course, it's just one of the supporters only things we've got for you. To find out all about all that stuff, patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can go to politicsguys.com/support. And if you want to get in touch with us, you can do that through mail@politicsguys.com. There's our Facebook page, there's just been all kinds of stuff. I know, Jay, if you followed last week, it just a couple of the posts blew up. Kristen talked about why she would vote for Trump. And
exactly. Kristen had the temerity to say she would vote for Trump.
Oh, it was a heck of a discussion. Oh, my gosh, it was something. But anyway, you want to check out that and all kinds of other stuff. Facebook.com/politicsguys page. We are also on Twitter @politicsguys. And hey, if you haven't already subscribed to this show, it would be a big help. Doesn't cost you anything, helps us out. And also, if you can tell people about the show, that would be great as well. And, leaving reviews and ratings on wherever you listen to the podcast would be helpful too. The executive producer of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Benji Fishman, and Andra Masker. Today's show is produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.